Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 20. And here today in lecture, we are going to address a part of the world that admittedly we have neglected up until this point, Latin America. And so in this lecture, we'll take a look at a few case study examples of developments within that part of the world. And in doing so, not only fill in this lacuna in our story, account for this part of the world, but also see how what's developing in Latin America in the 20th century fits with or contrasts with some of the developments we've seen in other parts of the world up to this point. So in this lecture, we'll take a look at change and continuity in Latin America. We will account for this part of the world that we have neglected, and also connect the developments in Latin America to some of the broader themes in the class. So buckle up, here we go. We begin with Mexico in the early 20th century. Now, Mexico at this time is governed by a dictator, Porfirio Diaz, who consolidated control over Mexico in the late 19th century and would continue to rule Mexico until the revolution that begins in the early 20th century, which we'll soon describe. So, as we begin the 20th century, prior to that revolution, Mexico is governed by a one-man dictatorship led by Diaz, who used his personal dictatorship to aggrandize his own wealth and power, making deals with wealthy landowners in Mexico, but also welcoming in businessmen from afar, mostly American businessmen, to develop industrialization within Mexico. Diaz wanted to modernize Mexico. He wanted to bring in industrialization to this country. Industrialization is sweeping through the world, as we documented in our early lectures in the late 19th, early 20th century. And Diaz wanted to modernize the Mexico economy and also do so through a path towards industrialization. But similar to what we saw with Russia, he often brought into this process foreign investors who often came to control key elements of Mexico's economy and key resources in Mexico. And Diaz made partnerships with these foreign investors, which aggrandized his own personal wealth, but meant that they would largely be in charge of this process of industrialization and do so in a way that extracted wealth in Mexico and brought the profits back to places like the United States. John D. Rockefeller, the American titan of industry, the head of Standard Oil, was able to gain access to oil reserves in Mexico to aggrandize his own wealth, becoming the first billionaire in American history. But of course, you're literally removing wealth from Mexico to aggrandize the wealth of, in this case, a foreign businessman, an American businessman, John D. Rockefeller. Also, the industrial pattern that developed in Mexico, in addition to profiting outsiders and opening up Mexico's natural mineral wealth to outsiders, was very, very inconsistent. It was very uneven, where certain elements of the Mexican state were industrializing and then large other portions of the country remained closed off to industrialization, still a rural farm-based economy. So the economic development that Diaz hoped to spark through industrialization remained uneven. It remained largely the province of foreigners, with profits coming out of Mexico, and it led to an increasing disparity between a few Mexicans who were profiting from this industrialization, working in league and partnership with outside investors, and the many rural poor who did not own their own land and did not benefit from this industrialization, as they were cut off from it and its benefits. And so one of the effects of this pattern of industrialization was really aggrandizing a great disparity between rich and poor. However, many Mexicans did profit from this industrialization. They worked in league with foreign investors. They were able to open up their own factories. They began to invest in these new industries of railroad and oil. And that led to a rising middle class who was frustrated by the stasis in Mexican politics, where Diaz ruled as a dictator. The people in positions of power below him owed their allegiance to Diaz. So you have this very calcified state that cannot respond to the aspirations for greater power among this middle class, who see themselves as the meritorious because of their hard work, thrift, their embrace of these new trends of industrialization. Again, this is something we have seen in earlier lectures in other parts of the world. You have this old system that's closed. You have this old system that's based on patronage, favor. It is rooted in coercive power by which Diaz controls the army and can use it to suppress dissent. And yet you have this rising class of people who are wealthy, profiting, who see themselves as in the vanguard of the modern, who see themselves as the people who should be in charge because of their hard work, thrift, their willingness to invest, and also their education often in modern concepts like liberalism. And therefore, you have within Mexico in the late 19th, early 20th century, this rising middle class who is angry and frustrated at, again, a very closed, calcified system that does not allow, in their mind, for not only their own political aspirations to be in charge and take control of the Mexican government, but also in their mind, progress. This is, again, a story about what vision for progress ultimately will prevail. For this rising middle class, they want a revolution that will depose the Diaz regime and open up Mexico to this class of educated entrepreneurs, industrialists, who will lead Mexico forward in their vision of progress into modernity. Enter Francisco Madero, who would become the leader of that growing class of educated, middle-class aspirants who wanted to seek change, modernization in Mexico, who saw the Diaz regime, again, as this obstacle thwarting reform, progress, in the form of a liberal revolution. Madero was 37 when the Mexican Revolution of 1911 began. He was the son of a lawyer born into that Mexican middle class. He studied abroad. He went to the University of California at Berkeley, one of those lesser UCs. Don't let the snobs fool you. There's nothing better up there in Berkeley than here in Riverside. But that's where Madero studied. It's again a story of one who leaves and goes afar, learns new modern ideas, sees in the United States a nation with ostensibly free and fair elections, of course, many racial minorities and women excluded. Nevertheless, the United States seemed to function as a government of transparency where civil liberties were respected. And so Madero, like many of the other figures we've talked about here, was exposed to a different way of living, saw it in a very tangible way, as well as being exposed to new ideas in his studies at UC Berkeley. He took those ideas back to Mexico and became the leading voice in a call for reform and change. What would his vision of reform and change look like? Well, in many ways, it's that classical liberalism that we've encountered in early lectures and in many key incidences in 20th century global history. Let's have a system that rewards hard work, thrift, education, a belief in meritocracy. Certainly Madero and his cohort saw themselves as the true leaders of Mexico because of their education, not because of their cozying up to Diaz. In the Diaz regime, that's how you gain power, by deferring to Diaz, respecting his authority, not questioning him, and giving him lots of money. That was the way to be a political figure in the Diaz regime. Well, Madero says, no, smart guys like me should be in charge. And so he called for education for all so that a true meritocracy would prevail, where people who worked hard, who studied, who earned their degrees would have a pathway forward rather than the friends of Diaz who curried favor with Diaz. He wanted free and fair elections. He wanted, again, a respect for private property, civil liberties. Ultimately, his vision was one where Mexico would modernize through a liberal government, a constitutional republic, free and fair elections, private property, industrialization, capitalism, in many ways adopting models that Madero was exposed to while studying abroad, and models that were active and alive throughout the world in the 19th and 20th century in a time of liberal revolutions that, again, we've documented and described in previous lectures. In 1907, a massive recession hit the Mexican economy, and segments of the Mexican economy that were most tied to this middle class were hit hard. Those who, again, were active in the uneven, in pockets style of industrialization in Mexico, people who were working in concert with American companies and oil railroads. There was a wave of speculation, a wave of investment in Mexico in the early 20th century that became overheated, and ultimately the bubble of speculation burst. And again, the people who were hit hardest were the people who were in those industries, those that had been fueled by that rapid speculation. And now the bottom lines, the investment and wealth of this middle class is in decline. They're being hit hard by this recession. Now those industries, railroad, oil, mining, that had seemingly been booming came to an abrupt halt. And what this does is it further deepens the anger and discontent with Maderos of the world, that middle class, who really rally around Madero as their leader. They argue the problem is Diaz. The problem, again, is this closed system, this calcified state, the inability of smart, educated people to thrive and take positions of leadership. Diaz doling out positions of power to those who, again, sided with him. And so this recession aggrandized the already boiling discontent among the middle class. Previously, their discontent was about politics. It was about a system that did not accommodate their aspirations, a system that was closed, a system that, again, seemed to be at the whim of one man, Diaz, that rewarded patronage and loyalty rather than hard work, thrift, innovation, the values that the middle class saw as indeed values. But now, adding to that discontent regarding politics is economic discontent, economic deprivation. The middle class blamed Diaz for the recession. They blamed his very arbitrary leadership. They blamed Diaz in the way in which he retarded and stymied development, doing so in a way that aggrandized his wealth and power, but not in a way that truly allowed for a general and greater prosperity to prevail in Mexico. So this becomes a key tipping point, a key force in pushing this group towards revolution. Not only do we have the political discontent, now we have material discontent as the recession hits this middle class so hard. So we have a number of elements active in Mexico in the early 20th century that all indicate for the potential of radical transformation. There's a sense that politics is closed, unyielding. It is run by a few. It is run in a way that aggrandizes the wealth and power of that few, but neglects the true suffering and misery of many. There's a sense that there's a lack of development economically as a result of that closed political system. That Diaz is rewarding friends, that he's opening the country to foreigners who extract wealth, again, to the neglect or hardship of the many. And all of this, of course, conflicts with the growing aspirations of this middle class who believes that they should be in charge of the economy. They should be in positions to profit, that they deserve that position, not because they're cozy with Diaz, but because, again, they have followed the script of modernity. They've educated, invested, they've consolidated their power over key industries, and yet they remain, again, denied what they see as their just deserts. In order for a revolution to go forward, you certainly need a rising leadership class who will serve in the capacities we've seen earlier, articulating a lot of this discontent, this sea of sentiments underneath their position of power and authority. A plan forward, a vision of progress. But also, you need more than just this educated elite class. You need a buy-in. You need an embrace of radical change by the many. And in Mexico, there's discontent and anger among the have-nots, the people in rural areas who have not benefited from industrialization or arguably have been hurt by industrialization. You have this large impoverished class who live a hand-to-mouth existence in poor rural parts of the nation, who don't own the land that they work, who therefore have no incentive to work hard and profit and advance, and no opportunity to do so. And Diaz has very little to offer to this class of people who live in these rural areas, who live a very impoverished existence, who are denied access to opportunity, education. And so this too is one of those necessary ingredients we've seen earlier in the class in terms of sparking radical transformations, a large population of people who feel anger, discontent, and if this educated middle class led by Madero can create a sense of solidarity or connection with that large population of the impoverished, landless in Mexico, then again there is a greater potential for true change and revolution with that buy-in between the elites and the many. Also, we have seen in previous lectures how a sense of betrayal plays a role in radical transformations, that there are outsiders within who are responsible for misery and despair. We've seen different forms of that from the Russian Revolution, rise of fascism in Germany, and in Mexico you have a very similar dynamic where there has been this foreign presence that's been welcomed in by Diaz in a way that's very analogous to what we saw with Tsar Nicholas. And for those fomenting revolution, supporting revolution, this becomes a key foil, key argument that the wealth of our nation is being extracted by others, that the leadership class has betrayed the nation by welcoming in these foreigners who do little to profit the local economy, the livelihoods and standards of living of local people, but instead use their access to resources for their own personal wealth and development. There's a sense that the ruling class under Diaz are willfully giving away our wealth, our land, by opening up the nation in this way. And this is one of the arguments that the middle class and the impoverished large population can agree on, that the foreign presence is ultimately a deleterious one. And so all of this, again, the ingredients for radical transformation, a sense that there are deeply rooted problems in Mexico, and the political class is either unresponsive to them or responsible for them, that there's this impediment that is preventing a way forward, that Madero and his middle class cohort truly are invested in: liberalization, modernization, education, industrialization. And those may not be the true aspirations of the rural, landless, impoverished class, but that rural, impoverished class agree with the middle class that something needs to change, that there's little progress available. And so all of this, again, marshals sentiment against Diaz and seems to augur for radical change, that Mexico is being held back, that Mexico is again being stymied in its progress. Other nations are profiting, other nations are benefiting from what should be the benefits and profits of the Mexican people. And so you have a number of elements here, all that augur for radical change. And so we get revolution in Mexico in 1911. In 1910, Diaz orchestrated an election that was designed to give him legitimacy. He won, surprisingly, this rigged election that was, again, a sham there just to give him the image of legitimacy, something that the American and foreign investors were more than willing to go along with. But as we've now documented, the Mexican people had turned against Diaz, and there was true discontent spanning the Mexican population. And so when Diaz magically won this false, sham, rigged election, Madero emerges as the leader of an opposition to topple Diaz, arguing that Diaz clearly wants to rule ad infinitum for the rest of his life and is orchestrating these sham elections to undergird that. And so he must go. Responding to Madero's calls for revolution were leaders of different factions among the rural poor. In the South, you had Emiliano Zapata, who advocated for land reform, for redistributing land to the peasant class, the landless class in southern Mexico. And from the South, he launched an attack on the Diaz regime. In the North, you had Pancho Villa, who was the leader of a coalition of, again, landless peasants who sought to redistribute land in that part of Mexico, and he launched an attack on the Diaz regime from the north. And so this begins the fighting, the bloodshed of the Mexican Revolution in 1911. Ultimately, Diaz sees the writing on the wall. His coalition of patrons and clients and supporters is collapsing. He is facing this onslaught from both north and south. There's this rising figure of Madero who's crystallizing a great deal of these energies. And the sham election that he orchestrated is not enough to quiet this. And so he, seeing the writing on the wall, flees. And in 1911, Madero would be elected president of Mexico. But the inability of Madero to coalesce a legitimate government with all of this discontent and this fracturing, these different elements of revolution advanced by Villa and Zapata, meant that quickly the Madero regime, the Madero government would collapse. And he faced opposition not only from Zapata and Villa, who wanted a much more aggressive redistribution of land. Madero, a classic liberal, he wanted again to create a constitutional republic, further industrialization. That's not what was motivating other revolutionary figures like Villa and Zapata. And so there is that discontent. But also there are a lot of people who want to reestablish a dictatorship in the Diaz model and profit in the ways that they did under Diaz. There are those groups of clients and patrons that have continued to see their positions erode under the Madero government. And they too want to depose Madero because they want to reestablish a one-man dictatorship that will secure their interests. So there are many interests at stake. There are the aspirations of Zapata and Villa towards land reform. Madero doesn't offer that. Madero wants, again, a liberal republic that very much is dedicated to preserving the goals and aspirations of the middle class, that is particularly dedicated to private property, that fears the mob, that element of liberalism we talked about in our very first lecture. And to Madero and this middle class group, Zapata and Pancho Villa represent that mob. And then there's this other faction of former loyalists to Diaz who want to go back to a one-man dictatorship that will secure their positions of power built on privilege. And leading that coalition was Victoriano Huerta, who attacks the Madero government. Ultimately, Madero is murdered in 1913, killed in this action, and Huerta attempts to reestablish a Diaz-style government. That leads to blowback and resistance from the heirs to Madero's effort, including Venustiano Carranza, who is a liberal, who wants to return to the liberal government that Madero helped create, fears Huerta, fears the return of a Diaz-style government. So Carranza represents the aspirations and goals of, again, that middle class that fears that the revolution of 1911, the revolution that Madero spearheaded, is slipping away, and we're going to go right back to a one-man dictatorship under now Victoriano Huerta. And Carranza, no advocate for radical land reform, redistribution, is willing to build an alliance with Villa and Zapata to remove their common enemy, Huerta. For Villa and Zapata, Huerta is also a big problem because we're right back to a Diaz-style government and there's no land reform. There's no redistribution. And so they partner with Carranza as they have a common goal, a common enemy, and they remove Huerta. And in 1917, there's a successful effort to reestablish what Madero had sought as he was elected president in 1911. Carranza will be elected president under a new constitution that returns Mexico to that liberal-style government. And Mexico, to this day, has that same government. But what is being unaddressed here? What hasn't changed? The fate of the large, landless, impoverished class. So the end story of the Mexican Revolution is a liberal republic, a constitution, and to some extent a political change in line with the goals of Madero. And in the 20th century, Mexico would further industrialize, it would open to foreign investment, and that's the Mexican economy we have today, where there is a great deal of manufacturing in Mexico, often, again, from foreign companies operating in Mexico. You had with NAFTA in the 1990s, the acceleration of industrial jobs once here in the United States, moving to Mexico, the rise of maquiladoras. So many international companies are operating now in Mexico, as Mexico is a center of manufacturing, as manufacturing has declined in its northern neighbor, the United States. You have the continuation in Mexico today of this constitutional republic that was established in 1917, but not really true land reform in the hopes of Zapata and Villa. Those aspirations ultimately were thwarted, and that explains a great deal of the disparity in wealth in Mexico that prevails to this day. So this is the story of the Mexican Revolution. In 1911, you had a lot of chaos and disorder, different factions. Ultimately, what prevails is a liberal constitution, but what again goes unaddressed were the goals of people like Zapata and Villa for true redistribution of land and wealth that could have addressed the true concerns of the impoverished landless class in Mexico. All right, let's turn our attention now to some case study examples from Latin America in the second half of the 20th century. And we begin with a story of radical transformation, but also decolonization that we can fit together, compare, contrast with other stories of radical transformation, revolutions, and decolonization that we've encountered in the class, particularly in recent lectures. In this case, we're talking about Cuba. In one of our very first lectures, we talked about the rise of the United States as a global empire, how in the mania for colonial imperialism in the early 20th century, the United States enters that club alongside the British, the French, the Germans, the Japanese, with the Spanish-American War. And as a result of the Spanish-American War, the United States would not only intervene in the Philippines, taking the Philippines as a colony, but the United States also intervened in Cuba and would come to control Cuban politics for the first 60 years of the 20th century. The United States leaves in the in the 1920s. It installs a series of dictators who rule with American support, who rule because they're willing to open Cuba to American investment. So at the end of the Spanish-American War, the United States would begin its intervention in Cuba. In the 1920s, the United States leaves Cuba, but with an agreement from the Cuban government it helped install to continue to open Cuba to American investment. And so you had this symbiotic relationship between military rulers in Cuba and the United States, where they received the support and sanction of the United States in turn for opening Cuba up to American investment. In the 1950s, the last of these dictators was Fulgencio Batista, who, like previous dictators in Cuba, enjoyed great support from the United States, opened Cuba to American investment, and in return was able to govern Cuba with that American support. However, over the decades of this relationship of opening Cuba to American investment and intervention, there developed, alongside the industries that American investors brought to Cuba, an educated middle class. And again, this fits with trends we've seen in previous stories of radical transformation and decolonization, that the effort to colonize Cuba, and in this way we're seeing the United States played this role in Cuba, first by directly controlling Cuba until the early 1920s, and then indirectly controlling Cuba as a sort of pseudo-colony through its embrace of these dictators. This again can be seen as a narrative of decolonization, and like previous stories of colonialism, when a foreign power intervenes in another nation and invests and creates certain industries that profit that colonizer, necessarily that creates an educated group of local people profiting from their ties to this foreign power, and they begin to develop ideas that will eventually lead to revolution or decolonization. And that's what's happening in Cuba. There are the American investors, there are their partnerships with local people on the ground who necessarily are folded into that industrialization, whose sons become educated, often at foreign universities, and they become the revolutionary leadership, who is able to build an alliance with the last group in Cuban society, the large, poor, rural population. In this case, the leader of that movement, an educated elite from the middle class, who builds this alliance with the disgruntled, angry, poor peasant class, Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro, like other leaders we've seen earlier, has a great skill, a great ability to live in two different worlds. He was an educated elite who came out of that Cuban middle class, educated in law, learned, again, Marxist doctrine and other foreign ideas, but was able to domesticate them for the local scene in Cuba and stylize himself as a populist, a leader of the many landless, poor peasants in Cuba. So he was of both worlds, the educated elites, those in Cuban society who had studied abroad, been particularly influenced by foreign ideologies, among them Marxism, but Castro could also connect with the many, the poor, and offered them land and redistribution in a socialist model. And so it is, again, very analogous to other stories of decolonization and radical transformation we have seen earlier, where a middle class develops, necessarily through colonialism. That middle class becomes a hotbed of radicalism, sometimes in favor of liberal transformations, in this instance, in terms of socialist or communist transformations. And a leader emerges who kind of bridges these two camps of discontent. The middle class, who are angry about foreign intervention, propping up, in this case, the Batista regime. Batista was a cruel, repressive despot who thwarted the ambitions of this middle class, but also punished the poor landless in Cuban society. And here comes Castro saying, I can lead us forward to true change. And he offers the poor what they really want, a chance at land, at true economic transformation. And in 1959, after unsuccessful efforts earlier, Castro was able to launch a successful revolution against the Batista regime and seize the capital of Havana, sparking the Cuban Revolution of 1959. So this is a narrative of radical transformation as Castro stylized himself as a Marxist, but it's also a story of decolonization. What's really driving this was that foreign presence of the United States that had shaped Cuban history since 1898 and the Spanish-American War. The long legacy of intervention by the United States in a way that alienated the Cuban people, punished the Cuban people by propping up these brutal, repressive dictators who opened up Cuba to foreign investment, foreign profit, but did very little for either the Cuban middle class and their aspirations or the goals of this large, poor Cuban peasant population. And so discontent leads to revolution, and in 1959, the American-sponsored dictator Batista is removed, and Fidel Castro seizes control of Cuba, a radical transformation now realized. And so the effort in 1959 in Cuba proved successful. The uprising led by Fidel Castro led to, in Cuba, the creation of a communist state. And Castro took swift action to show real results to the Cuban people as a result of his efforts. He nationalized land. He nationalized foreign businesses as part of his strike against capitalism, as part of his rhetoric about Cuban nationalism, the idea that these assets should benefit the Cuban people, and yet, for decades, outsiders, exploiters have come in and profited off Cuba's resources. So he worked to nationalize foreign businesses, taking their property, nationalizing private property held by foreign businesses, as well as land also owned by foreigners who had been active in Cuba since the 19th century in things like the sugar trade. Though Castro had taken power, many who had sided with the Batista regime, any loyalists to the Batista regime, and certainly the employees of American businesses that were now being subject to this nationalization, had a fear of now living in a Castro-run Cuba. And so this led to the first massive exodus of Cubans from Cuba to the United States. There is a long, interesting, complicated, and ongoing history about Cuban refugees to the United States. In 1959, after the communist takeover of Cuba, that begins for the first time and continues to this very day. And I encourage all of you, if you're interested in this history, to read more about the Cuban-American experience and the ongoing policies, clashes, divides regarding Cuban refugees in America, as that is often swept up in larger debates about immigration in American history. The very first large exodus of Cuban exiles fleeing Cuba were largely comprised of, again, loyalists to Batista, those who feared the reprisals of Castro, many of who were in league with foreign businesses, and the wealthy. The wealthy fled in large numbers because they feared this loss of assets. They feared that their wealth would be confiscated in a now communist state. So the people who left Cuba weren't just random Cubans. They were people who were politically opposed to Castro. And that creates in the United States, as part of this exodus, a large Cuban-American population who tends to be very anti-Castro, anti-communist, and conservative in their politics. They become, and to a large extent remain to this day, loyal supporters of the Republican Party, which tended in the Cold War era to have the most intense rhetoric, at least rhetoric, not always policy or reality, in opposition to the Soviet Union, Castro's Cuba, and other communist states. So the intense, fiery, anti-communist rhetoric of the Republican Party in the Cold War era drew a lot of Cuban Americans, Cuban exiles, and that's part of the nature of Florida politics to this very day. So again, there's a long, complicated, and ongoing history here, but it's important to note that the people who left Cuba were not just a cross-section of Cuban society. They were wealthy. They were tied to the Batista regime. They were tied to foreign investment, foreign corporations. Many of them were employees of American corporations. And so they tended to have a political orientation opposed to communism, Castro, and they became a key lobbying bloc in the United States for policies opposed to Castro. In addition to nationalizing businesses as part of Castro's plan for creating Cuba into a communist state, he established a national health care program, a national education program, and this is also important in understanding in regards to contemporary Cuban-American relations. Castro did things that many Cubans benefited from and supported. And he did so because he wanted to pay off on the rhetoric he was employing. He wanted to offer tangible consequences and change for the Cuban people. If nothing changed after Castro took over, well, that would certainly lead to a great deal of discontent, disillusionment among the Cuban people. So he wanted to make tangible changes that would directly affect the lives of the Cuban people. I've been dancing around this for some time. It's important perhaps to make it more in the forefront. Certainly there's this ongoing history between the United States and Cuba. We all inherit that. It's an ongoing issue. And there have been many efforts, some we'll detail in a moment, by the United States to undermine the Castro regime in Cuba. And one of the things that's always flummoxed the United States, this is related to our recent lecture about the American war in Vietnam, the United States believe that, well, the Cuban people want us to overthrow Castro. They'll be thrilled if we launch an invasion. And like the American war in Vietnam, that demonstrates an inability to understand local politics, nationalism. The United States has this belief that it can march around the globe in the Cold War and bend the world to our designs, and that doesn't take account for the subjectivities, inclinations, and complexities of all these places we seek to intervene in. We saw that with our efforts in Vietnam, that we're doomed to fail. We were trying to impose upon a government, upon a people who had been fighting for the right to govern themselves for decades. And the United States often approaches Cuba with this hubris, with this ego, that of course the Cuban people want to live in an American-style democracy and they want to be free of the Castro regime. The thing that Americans often forget in that calculation, a number of American presidents and administrations who try these efforts to undermine the Castro regime, is one, nobody wants the United States deciding who your government is. This is, again, very vexing to people who have long been colonized in Cuba by the Spanish for centuries and then later by the Americans. And so like in Vietnam, nobody wants America to come in and engage in this neo-colonialism. You'll get a backlash because Cubans are nationalists. They want a nation of their own. And the other thing is that a lot of Cubans supported the reforms that Castro established. They didn't feel as if they were suffering in a way that demanded liberation. But American efforts at such a liberation or overthrow indeed took place. Because, as we have established, these two key trends of the second half of the 20th century take place at the same time. Cold War and containment. The lectures since the lectures on World War II, our lectures here on the post-World War II era, have focused on those dynamics. Cold War era, and it's also an age of decolonization, and the two are deeply connected, deeply braided together. There is this effort to decolonize Cuba through a communist revolution led by Fidel Castro. But all that takes place at the height of the containment era, that period that we described, the first phase of the Cold War, where the United States is dedicated to containing the spread of communism around the globe, where the United States is intervening in events like the Korean War. The United States is sending Peace Corps volunteers around the globe. The United States is convinced that the world must live as we do, that our way is a global way, and we're going to use all of our resources to stop the spread of communism. And then, at the height of that commitment, at the height of the containment era, there is a communist revolution a few hundred miles off the coast of Florida. in a part of the world that Americans had long been urged to see as ours to mold, ours to design, a part of the world that was imagined to be America's domain, and in particular, in a nation, Cuba, that had long been subject to American intervention, going back to 1898. So this idea of Cuba, of all places, as one to fall to communism was anathema to the containment mentality that prevailed in the 50s and 60s. That was a consensus point in American politics, something that Democrats and Republicans agreed upon. We have to do this. We have to stop the spread of communism. And then when you see communism spreading right there in what you see as your backyard, in a part of the world that you had long dominated or intervened within, well, you're going to get the response that you do, where the United States now wants to use its resources to roll back the Castro Revolution. In 1960, a year after Castro takes control, we launch a boycott in an effort to cut off trade to Cuba and economically cripple this island nation. And this, again, is still a constant issue in American politics today, this idea of whether it's better to sanction Cuba, refuse to do business with Cuba, punish the Cuban people and the Cuban government in this fashion in an effort to stay tough against the now brother, of Fidel Castro, who rules Cuba, in an effort to roll back this revolution that began in 1959. That is the opinion of many American politicians. It has been the policy of the United States really since 1959. Let's cut off trade with Cuba. Let's cripple Cuba. Let's deprive the Cuban people of material gain and benefits from trade. Let's use our economic muscle to cripple Cuba, and they will come running to the joys and pleasures of free market capitalism. Hasn't worked yet, but we're still trying, right? Check your watch any minute now. It will be a thriving capitalist paradise anytime soon. So this continues to be an issue. There have been some, like Barack Obama, who tried a different approach, open relations with Cuba, but the Trump administration closed the door on that, largely because of the importance of Cuban-American voters in the Republican Party and Florida as a swing state. So we, in the Trump era, returned to this very kind of aggressive stand against Cuba. We'll see what happens with the Biden administration and whether or not they'll try to go back to the more flexible, open relations that the Obama administration tried to pioneer. But overall, certainly beginning in this period of containment, the approach to Cuba has been one of boycott, cut off trade, try to punish the Cuban government in an effort to reform the Cuban government. In response to this, Castro created a close connection with the Soviet Union and sought aid from them to counterbalance the terrible effects of this American boycott so that the Cuban people could continue to have access to the material goods they needed. And so one of the consequences of this very hostile, aggressive action by the United States, that again makes sense if you remember it's the containment era, where there's no compromise with communism, where there's this all-out assault on any advance of communism. The United States takes that stand, and this pushes Castro to a closer connection with the Soviet Union. In 1961, President John Kennedy, who had been recently elected in 1960, was particularly focused on Cuba and rolling back the communist revolution. And he created an operation in league with Cuban exiles that was designed to invade Cuba, overthrow the Castro administration, and go back to where we were just a few years prior to 1959. It was an absolute disaster. The forces who landed in Havana did not receive enough support from the American military. They were quickly routed. And this was an absolute disaster, not only for the death that occurred, but also because it was a great blow to this idea that Kennedy and the United States could again mold the world to our designs, that if we don't like the government down in Cuba, well, we could just invade and overthrow that government. Castro's close connection with the Soviet Union led to what many historians argue is the closest moment since Nagasaki when nuclear arms likely could have been used, or the closest moment to an actual nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States, when the Soviet Union sought to put missiles in Cuba, nuclear warheads, in an event that's known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The idea of nuclear missiles in Cuba, just a few hundred miles off the coast of Florida, so proximate to the United States, was anathema to the Kennedy administration. They were not going to abide this, and this really led to the most heated, intense moments of the Cold War, where the Soviets seemed to be determined to put missiles in Cuba, aggressively confronting the United States, and the only recourse the United States seemed to have was to threaten a nuclear strike. And a lot of information has now become available thanks to nosy historians and our freedom of information requests. And a lot of this documentation that's now being declassified is really illuminating how very close we were in 1962 to, indeed, a nuclear war. Thankfully, it didn't come to that, and the Soviets withdrew their effort to install missiles in Cuba, but this really demonstrates how Cuba, after the Castro revolution, really became, in many ways, one of the key, if not the key, nexus of the Cold War. So, another narrative of decolonization, another narrative of radical transformation, one that has unique properties to it. Here's another example, like China and the Soviet Union, of a communist state being established, one that more or less endures to this day. But it played out, again, in the peculiarities of Cuba in the 20th century, how it was, first, an American colony after 1898. The United States occupied Cuba until 1924, and arguably still occupies at least a part of Cuba, as we retain a military base in Cuba, Guantanamo Bay. After the United States mostly leaves Cuba in 1924, you had decades of American intervention, a form of neocolonialism, and propping up the Batista regime. Well, that created the dynamics we've talked about here, and as I've said throughout the slide, stay tuned because the Cuban-U.S. relationship continues to evolve to this very day with many complexities and many ramifications we don't always truly understand and appreciate. Let's conclude our look at modern Latin American history with one last case study, and one also deeply influenced, inflected by the context of the Cold War. And this final case study concerns Chile. After World War II, as part of America's commitment to being a great global interventionist power, as part of the containment era where America is dedicated to stopping the advance and creep of communism around the globe, there was heavy American intervention in Latin America, in nations that we saw as vulnerable to a communist takeover, and therefore lots of Peace Corps volunteers go to Latin American nations. There's a great deal of economic intervention in these nations, as well as military aid, and a great deal of support for brutal repressive dictators who, though we claimed in the Cold War we were ambassadors of democracy, ran regimes that were anything but democratic and often were responsible for brutal crimes against their people and stealing outright from the wealth of these nations. So it's the Cold War, it's the containment era. America is committed in particular to intervening in Latin America, as America had long seen this as our domain, going back to absurd things like the Monroe Doctrine of the early 19th century. This intensifies with the Cuban Revolution, where there's a fear, a domino effect sort of idea that if it happened there, it could now take root in Honduras, in Guatemala, in Chile. And so in response to that fear, as part of the containment era, as part of America's role in this American century, the United States is deeply involved in Latin American nations, and in particular in Chile, where there's a great deal of American economic activity, American economic investment, America controlling in many ways certain industries in Chile. And as a response to that, there's this populist movement in Chile, nationalist movement in Chile, that rallies around Salvador Allende, who becomes the champion of reform in Chile, reform that will advance the interest of Chileans, that will counterbalance this American foreign presence and be much more redistributive in terms of land reform for poor Chileans. There is this program proposed by Allende of gradual transformation of the Chilean economy in ways that are nationalist, that are much more geared towards the interest of the Chileans, that involve local industries rather than foreign investment, and very anti-American, very pro-Chilean in this nationalist, in this populist rhetoric. Allende wins the presidency in 1970 in a free, fair, democratic election, and slowly begins to put his plan into action, including nationalization of certain industries, meaning seizing foreign assets, seizing land owned by foreigners, and redistributing it to the Chilean people. Well, it may have been the early stages of the détente era overall in the Cold War, but as I noted in our lecture on détente, on the second phase of the Cold War, détente prevailed in relations with the Soviet Union and China, but America, in regards to developing nations, decolonized nations, what was then referred to as the Third World, really continued its containment point of view in the 70s and 80s, continuing to intervene in these parts of the world and continuing to prop up terrible dictators. In fact, in the 70s and early 80s, we were at the height in many ways of that effort, in the Philippines with Marcos, in Iraq with Saddam Hussein. And so, though overall the Cold War was shifting towards a détente perspective in regards to our relations with the Soviet Union and China, the United States reacted to Allende's rise in a very containment-like approach, seeking to stop what they saw as Allende's socialism or communism, this idea of nationalizing industries, redistributing land, establishing price and wage controls. To the United States, that smacks of communism, socialism, in a part of the world that, again, America for decades had been dedicated to intervening upon in a way that would limit the spread of communism. And all this leads to a coup. On September 11th, 1973, a coup that killed Allende and saw Augusto Pinochet installed now as dictator. And Pinochet would not only be the dictator in Chile, and with it the end of Allende's life, political career, and agenda, but he would be a dictator. Pinochet, sponsored and supported by the United States. He joins that rogues gallery along with Saddam Hussein, Ferdinand Marcos, and many others as dictators that the United States was actively in the process of supporting because, again, it tended to see these events, even in the 1970s, even in the détente era, through that lens of containment, where this was removing Allende, who we identified as communist, and installing someone who would be fiercely an anti-communist and reopen Chile to American business interests, American industry. So Pinochet would ultimately rule for decades, and he would do so with the tacit or sometimes explicit support of the United States. Eventually in 1990 he's driven out, and Chilean politics would move forward in a more democratic fashion, and key economic reforms and political reforms have aided the development of Chile. But the legacy of American intervention, the horrors of the September 11th, 1973 coup linger on. And that, too, is something we can think about in order to understand contemporary politics, not just in Chile, but again in other parts of the world where we've seen this, the legacies of colonialism, the haunting effects of violence and its aftermath. It's hard in Chile to move on from September 11, 1973, because that event still haunts contemporary Chilean politics. What did you do during the Pinochet era still is an active and important question in Chilean society and Chilean politics, much like after the American war in Vietnam. There is that civil war and reprisals that come in Vietnam, much like in many of the nations that we have seen in Africa, where the colonial era so still influences and prefigures contemporary relations in a period of colonialism where groups were pitted against each other. We have lectures to come on Southwest Asia, Middle East, that also will demonstrate how events there today, now in the 21st century, are again so deeply framed by the past and the legacies of intervention by foreign powers and the United States. And though the Pinochet era would end, the ghosts of the Pinochet era still in many ways persist in Chile to this day. So, legacies, that too is something for us to think about as we in these lectures make our way into the late 20th and early 21st century in these narratives of decolonization, in the question of whether the Cold War ends or whether or not it's just turned into a different third phase. The reality we live in today is one in which the events we've covered in recent lectures, the American War in Vietnam, American intervention in the Cold War, the Cuban Revolution, these events of recent global history still in many ways influence the global present.